This is Ryan and Michelle, and welcome to the Celebrate MarriageCast, where we hope to restore and reclaim godly marriages through honest and real conversations.
And welcome to episode 32. Today we have a special author guest joining us.
Yes. And Michelle, we've been so blessed to have really some of the best of marriage ministry in this space of marriage ministry. We've had the opportunity to interview Ted Cunningham, Shaunti Feldhahn, Dr. Kim and Nancy Kimberling. And today we have another tremendous guest for you, Gary Thomas.
Gary Thomas is a best-selling author and international speaker whose ministry brings people closer to Christ and closer to others. He's the author of numerous books. I'm sure that you've heard of some of them. Has sold over 2 million copies, won numerous awards. Some of the books include Authentic Faith, Cherish, Lifelong Love, and Sacred Marriage. He's currently teaching pastor and adjunct faculty member at 2 different seminaries. Gary's speaking ministry has led him to speak in all 50 states and 9 different countries and on numerous national television and radio programs. And today, for the first time on the Celebrate MarriageCast. Gary, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here.
Would you tell us a little more about your family, wife, children, and maybe what hobbies you like to do?
Well, my wife and I will celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary in about 6 weeks. So we're looking forward to that. We have 3 adult children, 2 grandchildren that really are the most adorable grandchildren in the history of the world. So We're loving that. I'm now a teaching pastor at Cherry Hills Community Church, which is south of Denver. We came here after spending about a dozen years in Houston, but we grew up and spent early years in the Seattle, Washington area. So we were kind of Northwest people. I really suck when it comes to hobbies. I like to run. I know you guys have done a couple marathons.
Awesome.
I've done a bunch of them, and that was really fun. And some of my bucket moments in life have been some of those marathons. So, and then we read a lot. And we're enjoying this time. We loved raising kids. We never looked forward to being empty nesters. But for our marriage, it's been some pretty sweet years.
Cool.
Very cool.
That's awesome. So, Gary, I'll just ask you, Michelle and I have run a few marathons. Yep. What's been your favorite race you've ever done?
Well, can I say 2?
Sure.
I tried for years to qualify for Boston. I finally got to do it 3 times, but the first time it really was a bucket list for me because I'd failed several times trying to get in there. I'm not particularly naturally gifted. I really had to work hard. I had to get my weight down. I had to do all of these things, and it lived up to the experience. And a lot of those bucket lists don't. So it was really special getting to do Boston. And then I think the second one was the Munich Marathon.
Oh, wow.
It ends in the same stadium where Frank Shorter won his gold medal. I think it was 72. Wow. So I was a 10-year-old, and I saw this guy with pencil arms running and winning the gold, and I thought, hey, I could be like him. He's got pencil arms. And so getting to run that race in Munich, which is one of my favorite cities in the world, and ending in that stadium really was a highlight. That was my 14th.
Wow.
That's so cool.
That's so cool. So cool. I'll share with you one if you want to add one to your list. We did one on Catalina Island off the coast, California. And it was the most beautiful, hardest thing that we've ever done.
Mm-hmm. That's a great marriage building activity.
Yeah. I was not prepared. It's more of a trail run, and I was not ready for that. I knew like we got just out of, like you run out of this little town, and about a mile out, everyone just stopped. And I'm like, what is going on? They're walking up the hill because it's so steep. And I'm like, oh no, I'm in big trouble.
We later realized that the vertical climb of the whole race was almost 6,000 feet, which is a mile.
Goodness.
So not only did we run 26.2 forward, we ran a mile up, which was crazy. But definitely a great mental game.
I don't like to do trail runs as much because I only have one functioning eye, so that my depth perception is off. And I trip too much on those.
Sure.
So I like roads and wide trails.
Flat.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm stumbling all the time.
Me too.
Yeah,
Flat
for sure.
is good.
For sure. Well, Gary, we hear all the time in our church, as we jump into this here about your book, Sacred Marriage. It's just, you've written multiple. We hear this one in particular a lot of just praise on this one. Read it, absolutely loved it. This idea of marriage being holy, and it just is an absolutely incredible book. And today we're gonna jump into your newest book here. Making Your Marriage a Fortress, which Michelle and I have both read. Yep. Michelle, you read and listened to it.
I did. I'm an audio learner as well, so that is my tip to our listeners, that you can read and by listening, and then I'll kind of reference the book. I'll underline in there, but I did both, and that was very good for me. And I like that you read it too. You read the audio book. I like it when the author reads it, so that was cool.
Yeah. I love this, making your marriage a fortress. I love that visual of this idea of a fortress, this strong, mighty fortress. And who wouldn't want that, for their marriage to be a fortress. So if that's all right, we'll dive into it here with our listeners. Really, the first thing, Gary, just right off the beginning of the book here, you start with this analogy. You're in Houston, Texas. Yes. 2017, Hurricane Harvey. Maybe give us just kind of a recap of this, and then really kind of how you tie this in directly to marriages.
We moved to Houston in 2010 and spent most of our life in the Pacific Northwest, also 9 years out in Northern Virginia. That's a different story. And when we first moved there, Seattle has rain, and there's supposed to be a huge volcano eruption from Mount Rainier, but I grew up with that and it hadn't happened. But in Houston, every fall, late summer, you have this hurricane season, get prepared, and it sounded terrible. And so we would have everything, and nothing happened in 2010 or 2011 or 2012. You're there 5 or 6 years. And so again, it's hurricane season. And a lot of times they would say, oh, this could be a big one. And it never really was. And so when they started talking about Hurricane Harvey, we're like, yeah, we've heard that before.
Right.
And then this was different. It came and it hit, and initially wasn't that bad, but then the rainstorm just sort of camped out over Houston and dropped 55 inches of rain in 3 days. It felt like Noah's flood. I mean, it was biblical. The water was rising up on our street. It was going to come up into our house. And at that point, I thought, we jokingly live, I mentioned this in the book, in a place called the Heights in Houston. I researched the name of that, and I think it's because we were 28 feet above Houston. When we're right outside, Houston is flat. You could watch a dog run away for 3 days in Houston. And so we thought, well, it's no big deal. And we were glad for those 28 feet. By God's mercy, our house stayed dry. But a lot of neighborhoods didn't. Thousands of homes were flooded. Over 100 people died. Billions of dollars of damage. So that one night when the water just inched up to our porch, I was starting to think, oh man, I got to do something. So I go into the garage, and I'm so pathetic when it comes to these kind of things. The only thing I could find was cardboard and blue painter's tape. We didn't even have real tape. I'm trying to find any way to keep water out, which it was useless at that point. It's only by God's mercy our house didn't get wet, because I always thought, well, everybody says the storm's going to come, but it doesn't come, and then it doesn't come, and then it just won't. And I think in marriage, we think the same thing. We hear of, oh, they had financial crisis. Oh, but we won't. We've been to Dave Ramsey stuff, or they had an affair. Oh, that would never happen to us. Or they had a medical crisis. Well, we're healthy people. And we see these storms all around us. The reality, you guys, is if you're married for a lifelong, there will be storms in your marriage. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We do not live in a world that's kind to marriages. Many things pull us apart. Physical things, sickness, disappointing things, spiritual warfare, temptations, all of those things seem to gather again to pull us apart. And so if we know the storm is coming, don't be like I was with Harvey, What do I have? I've got cardboard and some painter's tape. The same thing is recognize if my marriage is going to face a storm, what can we do ahead of time to be prepared? And so this book was different than my others. I'd written several marriage books of my own, Sacred Marriage, A Lifelong Love, Cherish, and some others. But this one, I went to couples who were very wise. I didn't want to just talk to couples who had had bad things happen to them, but really wise, godly couples who could share, okay, this is what we went through. This is what we did wrong. This is what we did right. And this is what we would say to people going through it. And pulled out all these principles for how, when the world seems to be collapsing, one of two things will happen. The world will tear your marriage apart, or you'll learn to cling together to face the world's assaults. Because if your marriage falls apart when the storm hits, that's the biggest storm. That's a bigger issue than the storm. Yeah. So the whole book is, how can you let these things draw you together? And I was just so excited to release this because these are just wonderful couples I want the world to get to know.
Yeah. Gary, I love that analogy of the storm, right? And marriage facing the storm. And the book is tremendous in that it tackles some major storms. You know, everything from busyness in life to intimacy, to finances, to even faith, you know, to look at those things and the fact that storms will happen. There's a quote in the book that I love. When hurricanes hit, one of two things will be true for you relationally. One, the state of your marriage will become part of the problem, adding to your woes, or two, the strength of your marriage will be a refuge against the storm.
Yes.
I love that. I love that quote in the book. And I love this analogy. It's so good.
Yeah. And really, as we looked at it, there were a couple of overarching themes. What I love is that there are the 10 chapters. And like Ryan said, it covers busyness, infidelity, marriages that are, maybe long distance for a season, or just, children, all these different hard hitting things that really can be kind of coming up against the fortress of your marriage, but how to weatherproof your marriage for that. And one of the themes that we both observed was really having a marriage that feels safe. A place of safety. So if Ryan and I were to have, and this isn't in, and you reference this in your book too, not talking about physical safety, that's a whole different thing, but just emotional safety. If Ryan and I were to have a conversation about our schedules or intimacy or whatever, finances, how would we approach that conversation to make it safe? Can you talk about safety that you illustrate in the book and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, I think there are three couples where safety comes up and it's pretty powerful. And just the undergirding of this, the foundation is there's no intimacy without safety. It's why I know we're not talking about physical or emotional abuse. They obliterate safety. There's no possible way of building an intimate marriage if one spouse is feeling threatened by the other. But they're more subtle forms of safety. We talk about Deborah and Jonathan, who had 4 children, which can really pull you apart. It's a great blessing. But I love what Les Parrott says. Every time you give birth to a new child, you give birth to a new marriage. Yeah. It's not just your first child. This is second. Every new child, you have to create a new marriage, and you're going to drift apart. And Deborah and Jonathan were worried because they were finding themselves feeling pulled apart, and they'd had such an intimate marriage and whatnot. And the challenge is, when this happens, if you don't value safety, you can start to have accusations. You're not home enough, or you're working, prioritizing this over that or whatnot. And you have to understand, the point here is to express out of safety, before you challenge your spouse, you're the most important person in my life. I feel like we're drifting apart. How do we get back together? That's a whole lot better than, you're leaving me to do this all on my own, or, hey, I'm the one now that's having to provide. What more do you want? There's not any more of me. And Deborah and Jonathan do a great job. Deborah was working on her master's while they were having their first child. Jonathan he's an eye surgeon right now. He was in med school. And he says all the pictures that first year, is Jonathan laying on the couch holding the baby, sleeping together
exhausted.
Because they were so tired. But this book really stresses emotional connection. That's one of the biggest bulwarks against our marriage being torn apart. And emotional connection assumes that it's safe to share what's going on. And so another couple where we talk about the importance of safety is David and Terry. They got to a point in their marriage before they really knew the Lord or walked with him where they hated each other. But neither one really wanted to be the one to file for divorce. And a number of things happened. Terry ended up going into an affair, and then she got connected with the Lord. David, her husband, did as well. But they didn't reconnect emotionally. So they were firing spiritually and they were serving God, but they had never reconnected emotionally. And what they had to do is safety was the key to that. Terry had to make it safe for David to ask any question he wanted to ask. And instead of saying, why don't you trust me? Or, well, it was right for David not to trust her. She had broken his heart. She had cheated on him. It's when she said, David, you've asked me that question 100 times, because he was trying to trip her up on details. She goes, but it's my fault. You're suspicious. I will answer it 100 times. I just want you to know I'm so sorry. And I'm an open book. You can ask me anything you want. Because often I find it, and guys can really do this when they cheated on their wives, like, why aren't you over this? And I'll say to them, well, she may never completely get over this. And part of your repentance is having empathy for her as she works through it. And Terry had that for her husband. Okay, I created this situation. And it was out of that safety that they were able to put the marriage back together. Another big thing, a couple we talk about, is Barron and Christina. Barron is a military chaplain. He and Christina have spent over 2 years apart as he's been on deployments. Now, for some, it might not be the military. It might be business travel or whatnot. But what I love about them in making their marriage a fortress is being apart forced them to deal with some of the scariest issues, which for Barron was sexual temptation on the road. We're apart. What does that mean? And for him, safety was, they realized as a couple, okay, this is our issue, not just mine. How do we face this together? How can he and Christina connect? And you got to share. It's very vulnerable to share. I feel vulnerable because I'm away from you, and can we do this? And am I going to be rejected? Or all of those issues. And all of these couples found that ultimately emotional connection had to be built on this safe environment where it's safe to share your temptations. Barron found a lot of soldiers didn't want to share their temptations with their wives or wives with the husbands because, well, I don't want to scare them or whatnot, which meant they faced their temptations alone, which meant they were far less successful in beating back the temptations. So it's really focusing on making your marriage a safe place to share your hurts, your failures, your past, and let them know, I'm here for you. We're committed 100%. Divorce isn't on the table. Out of that, how do we build the new intimacy?
I love that. There was a quote in the book that said, as long as couples remain emotionally connected, their marriages can survive until they find a way around their differences. And I feel like that's what you just illustrated there, is that keeping that landline, that phone line open of emotional connection and paving the way to really talk through those big situations.
Dr. Joyce Skarka has done a lot of research on women and sexual shame, and I talked to her for this book. And she talked about how crucial it is, how healing marriage can be for women. Often it isn't because the women feel shame. Only guys are supposed to fall in this area, right? And one of the things that made it such a healing place on the positive sense is when the wife felt safe to share with her husband, and the husband learned to respond sensitively, that his initial response is so key. And if she feels like, I'm not leaving you, this is a safe place, I'm with you in facing this, that's what creates such a healing marriage. And that's what I love about this concept. Yeah. We all enter marriage beaten up. And you guys, that you both mentioned, there are a lot of hurts you had to deal with. So let's just get over that. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. but how in a safe way, with the gentleness and graciousness of Christ, who loves us in the midst of our sins. How can we find our way back to forgiving each other, loving each other, and being vulnerable to each other?
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, we say this all the time. I'm a big sports guy, but so like, but this concept of we're on the same team.
Yes,
and it's like you need to be able to share with your teammate, in order to, if you want to accomplish any goal or anything, like you have to be on the same page. I can't be running a different play than Michelle.
Right.
Like we have to be running the same play or it doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah, it's so good. So Gary, the other thing, just as we were going through this and reading this book, the other really big theme that we picked up on is this idea of you and your spouse may have different answers.
Yes.
Oftentimes we get stuck in this, I'm right. Well, if I'm right, then Michelle must be wrong. When in reality, that the right answer probably is somewhere in between. Would you be able to maybe walk us through this? What does this look like? Maybe walk us through what does a compromise look like?
One of my favorite couples that I talked about, I mean, they're all my favorite couples, but is in the early chapters is Daryl and Stacy. Stacy came from a broken home. And so she just felt safe with Daryl. He was a bodybuilder. Ryan, he could bench press 400 pounds. I don't know how much you can get up. That's
Not that much. I'll just say that.
350 more than I can get up. And he lit up the room. He was solid in his faith. And she thought, okay, this is the guy because I feel safe. 3 years after they got married, he's diagnosed with MS. And it kept progressing. And I knew them through the years where he went from walking to using a cane, to using a walker, to using a wheelchair, and now with a scooter. And they both had to process this. I mean, what do you do when the reason you got married is blown to bits? Yeah. Daryl wanted to be married to protect Stacy, to help her heal, to be there for her. Stacy married Daryl. She wanted a man who was safe, who could provide in all of this. Daryl hasn't been able to carry in the groceries for a couple decades. And so what happens? Now, they approached it differently. Daryl is a classic glass half full. And so when the diagnosis came through, this isn't a big deal. I'm going to get through this. I'm an athlete. And he started working out even more till the doctors told him, Daryl, you're making the situation worse. Your body can't recover. You've got to look at this realistically. Stacy looked at it glass half empty. This is a tragedy. This is terrible. This is when the reality is they were both wrong and they were both right.
Yeah.
Daryl needed some of Stacy's pessimism, not pessimism, but reality.
Right.
This is a big hit. This isn't something you just pray away. This is something you have to address. But Stacy needed Daryl's optimism that we will get through this. And something Stacy said that I will never forget. It's amazing that she could say this is they're, I don't know, maybe 25 years into this, and they're at a dinner. Daryl's now in a mechanized chair, and they have to go home early. Daryl doesn't do well if he's not in bed, before 9. But she said, I'm looking at it, so we're laughing, we're having a good meal, and I said to myself, Stacy, your worst fears came true, and life is okay.
Wow.
You and your husband love each other. You're having a good time with friends. And then she said, and this is what hit me, my fear of MS did more damage to our marriage than MS did to our marriage.
Wow.
And that's where, at this point, when you face these issues, if a child rebels or a child dies, you will grieve differently. The husband will grieve differently than the wife. The wife will grieve differently than the husband. Learn from each other. Don't judge each other. You may face finances differently. Going back to safety, it doesn't help to accuse each other. Why couldn't you earn more? Why didn't you see this happening? Why did you spend so much? But recognizing, okay, we're in this together. How can we learn from each other to do this? And here's the thing. I hated conflict when I got married. I thought if I married the right person, there wouldn't be conflict. Now I understand that conflict is an opportunity to understand my wife's fears, beliefs, hopes, and values. And if I look at conflict as an exploration, okay, this is why this motivates you. This is why this terrifies you. This is why this disappoints you. Then I can use conflict to get to know her, and we can become closer to each other. So there will be times when you have a different view. My counsel is two things. First, learn from the other person before you judge them. We're always convinced. Daryl thinks, yeah, the godly man, optimistic. He has faith. Stacy thinks the godly approach is to be realistic and to plan and to recognize. They were both right and they were both wrong. The second thing I found is often ask your spouse how much this matters if you can't agree. Is this a 10 to you or a 2? And if it's a 9 to your spouse and a 3 to you, hey, that's a good thing to let go. All right, we might not agree. This seems to matter more to you than it does to me. I want to let this go.
Gary, that's so good. Where can our listeners find your book? And would you like to share anything else about why they should read it, why they should pick it up?
Yeah. Well, my website's garythomas.com, but you can order the book anywhere, Amazon, Christian Books, any bookstore can get it. I think the importance of the book for me was to recognize these issues are going to happen. Storms are going to hit. Things that couples didn't imagine they would. And just the principles that come out of it. I think every couple has a chapter in them. And I just was thrilled to get with 10 couples and say, tell me the chapter of your life that other couples can learn from.
Yeah.
Why going through financial crises can bring you together instead of tear you apart. How can you survive an affair? There's one where the wife had an affair. There's one where the husband had an affair. Libido, when there are different libidos, which is true for about 80 to 85% of marriages. How can you navigate these issues in a way that can bring you closer together? And that's what's been inspirational for me. I learned so much from these couples and was just eager to share their wisdom with others.
That's so great. We'll put the link to your book in our show notes. And I do love that they were real life stories. I thought that was so helpful. Yeah. I do think you're right. Every couple is going to be able to relate to one of the couples featured. So. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Gary, we usually ask our guests some guest questions. Are you up for those?
Absolutely.
All right. Awesome. Well, Gary, we got 3 rapid fire questions here. We'll jump in. Gary, what is your marriage why? Why is marriage important to you?
Yeah. That's the easiest thing for me. My wife rolls her eyes because she says sometimes it's possible to quote a sermon without using Matthew 6:33, but it's really hard for me. Matthew 6:33 is seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. I think if you want to hold your marriage together, seeking first God's kingdom over your own happiness, your own comfort, your own financial advancement, even your family's welfare, is what holds a marriage together. When a marriage becomes selfish, when it's just about your own happiness or your own success, it becomes boring. You want to pour passion into your marriage, have a purpose greater than yourself. So often people come to me as a pastor. How can I get him to do that? How can I get her to do that? I want couples to get together and say to God, what can we do for you? And it's amazing how spiritual purpose breathes new passion in marriage. The other part of that is seek first his righteousness. If I'm seeking first the righteousness of Christ, I'm dying to those things that offend most wives. And I'm building the character qualities of Christ, compassion, kindness, graciousness, patience, and love that make a wife want to stay married to me. So if I'll just do what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, put his kingdom above my own, and regularly pursue his righteousness, my marriage will be lifted up accordingly. I think it's one of the best marriage verses in Scripture, even though technically Jesus isn't addressing married couples.
Wow. Yeah, that is so good. Mm-hmm. That is so good. Gary, best date night.
Okay, I'm going to give an answer. People are going to say, oh, that's such a guy talking. But I asked my wife this, okay? So I knew you're going to, hey, honey, what's our favorite date night? And we get to travel a lot because I speak and whatnot. Lisa loves to go to new places. And she goes, I'd say doing a new place, eating at a new restaurant, and hotel sex.
Awesome. That's great.
Love it.
That's great. All right. And then lastly, I believe after 40 years, what's bringing you joy in your marriage right now?
This will sound shocking to some people. I've written about it before, but I was quoting other people, and now I've got to experience it. My wife just got a new hip a few weeks ago. Her hip was so bad. The operation took twice as long as they thought, and she was really debilitated for a couple weeks. I'm Nurse Gary. I'm just taking care of her. I'm getting up through the night. She needs icing. She needs painkillers. She needs help getting up and whatnot. I don't know that I've ever been this tired, except when we had newborns and toddlers and whatnot. I've been doing this for a week or two, and I remember just looking out at the kitchen. I'd helped Lisa get out in the sun. She loves to lay in the sun. I'd gotten her out on the lounge chair and her book and her water and ice on her. And I'm just looking through the window, and I just overcome with emotions for her, thinking how I love that woman. And I just opened the door. I just really love you. And she's teary-eyed. She goes, thank you. And I always talked about how in God's view, and I believe this is true, feelings follow love. In the world's view, I'll love if I feel for you. And I think the biblical view of love, the feelings will follow if you love. And I was just serving my wife. I was loving my wife. And it flooded my heart. And I've written about how that happens if you look at love. And so I would say, if you want to fall in love with your spouse again, instead of judging them for what they're not doing, double down on what you are doing. Now, as always, this is particularly dangerous device if you're in an abusive marriage. We're not talking about when you're married to an addict or an abusive person when different dynamics apply. But in the normal, everyday marriage where you just get frustrated with each other and whatnot, I found doubling down on love and service, it awakens your heart, it refreshes your affection. And I was glad because I wrote about this 10 years ago. As they'll say, this is true. Love your spouse and your love will grow. It's a great way to renew your affections. Double down on loving your spouse. I wrote in a book for wives, Loving Him Well. This one woman was really frustrated in her marriage, and she was praying about it, and God gave her a question, and she said, God, that is the last question I ever want to ask my husband. But God was insistent. And so she went to him and said, what am I not doing for you that you want me to do for you? And the reason it was so hard for her to ask the question, she thought, there were 10 things I thought he should have been doing for me, and he wasn't. And for God to have the nerve to say, I ask him, what do you want me to do for you that I'm not doing? It changed her marriage. Wow. And I think it's the same principle. We can feel bitter and left out. We choose service first. Again, not talking about addicts, not talking about abuse, but in normal marriages, we choose service first. We double down, and it often renews our own affection and then invites our spouse to ask us, which is what happened with that woman.
Wow.
We become other-minded when we're then serving and giving, and then we go through that tough season together and come out stronger. That's so good.
So good.
Gary, thank you so much for being our guest on the Celebrate MarriageCast today. This has been so helpful and such an important topic. So thank you for sharing your book with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
For our listeners, we want to say thank you to you as well. Thank you for tuning in today. Please like, subscribe, share. That all helps us so much. And if you'd like to give feedback on the impact, we have a number you can text. Check out the show notes. We'll have Gary's book in there as well. If you need additional help or marriage resources, you can find us at celebrate.church/marriage, and have a great week.